Greetings and welcome to the Hilaritas Press podcast, where we explore the vast world of Robert Anton Wilson. In today's episode, guest host Zach West chats with Gabriel Kennedy about his recently released biography, Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. Zach and I first encountered Gabriel, a multimedia artist concentrating on the written word, visual art, and music, over 20 years ago at the Maybe Logic Academy, where he was known as Prop Anon or Propaganda Anonymous. He has written the definitive biography of Bob. Richard Metzger, formerly of disinfo.com, writes, Kennedy daftly unravels the threads of Wilson's complex inner life, shedding light on inspirations for his revolutionary ideas and assessing Ra's impact on today's popular culture. Prolific writer and interviewer David J. Brown writes, meticulously well-researched, profoundly comprehensive, and compellingly absorbing. And so, right here, right now, it's my great pleasure to share with you Zach's conversation with Gabriel Kennedy.
All right, Gabriel Kennedy, how's it going today?
Very good, Zach. Yeah, it's great to be here, man.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to do this. I'm really excited about this. I've read the book. I was very impressed. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm, mildly obsessed with both Robert Anton Wilson and history, and I learned a lot with both of those. What's really cool about it is that I feel like it's not just for bobheads. Like, I feel like if you like 20th century history and you like interesting characters, then this is like an amazing book. It's a cool journey. I really enjoy it. How was the writing process for you?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Zach. That was sort of the intention to create a micro history, if you will. You know, Wilson at the center of his own cyclone, the center of everyone in their own little universe, if you will. But what was great, it was how he interacted with, the time and place and culture around him. I mean, he was thoroughly in the mix, since ever since he was a kid, probably. He was just one of those people that, kind of found where the pulse was, wherever he was, whether it was in New York City, Chicago, or California, even Mexico and Ireland. And he was just able to, get close to it and gain inspiration from it. So, the process of writing the book was, it felt sort of like a final lesson of, Wilson was a teacher, a real sort of intellectual teacher for me. He's the writer that I've read more than any other writer. And that was before wanting to write a book about him. It was just, he's one of those writers that, from his fiction and then to his nonfiction, how he communicates in a certain, way that really resonates with maybe perhaps a certain personality or whatever. And that's a wide personality. I mean, people who like George Carlin, I think, would very much like Robert Anton Wilson. So that's saying a lot. I think it was people just didn't really know. He never really got the popular shine that he was maybe hoping for at one point in his career, and then eventually just said, forget about it. I'm just going to do what I do, which is what all artists have to do, it was a learning experience. I could just very simply put it like that. I learned so much from, constructing a biography to, just even editing a book like that. It took a lot of time,
Yeah. And so, like, is there anything about his legacy? Like, it's been, what has it been, like almost 20 years since he died? Did he die in 2007?
2007. That's right.
Yeah. And so where do you think his legacy is now as far as like, did you find that maybe had more of a following than you thought, or is he like getting more with technology? Is his following getting bigger? Have you found?
Well, honestly, like from my own perspective, well, first I'll say that, well, yeah, from my own perspective, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I put my head down and just went to work for years on this book. So, it was just making sure to update everything, right? And by doing so in a biography and seeking to, exactly as you said, like tell the story of Bob, but also as an artist in late 20th century America to a wider audience, because the way that he approached his life, I think, is something that it goes beyond 1960s counterculture. Like, I think there's lessons in how to approach life. By the way, this individual named Robert Anton Wilson did it. I think there's real humanistic lessons there. But I'll repeat what other people maybe have said, and I agree with. Really, I think that Wilson's popularity probably has grown, and especially in recent years. I think maybe with the rise in popularity of chaos magic. Chaos magic is global, and it's like all these young people are into it, which is pretty cool, And Wilson is, an influence on every single chaos magician. He's not Austin Spar or whatever, but he's mentioned in nearly everyone, Phil Hines' books, Peter Carroll's books, and Peter Carroll of course taught at the Maybe Logic Academy. So, maybe through that avenue, young people are coming upon Wilson's books, and then of course via online. And lastly, though, really because of the scholarship that's been done on Wilson in the last 8 to 10 years, there's now a slew of writers, from in the academic world, and then now in popular fiction, nonfiction that is writing about Wilson. So I would say his popularity has grown. I think that in comparison, maybe with Timothy Leary, like Timothy Leary's popular, not so many people know about Timothy Leary these days, as opposed to Robert Anton Wilson, which I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And so I was kind of thinking about going backwards through his life. So if you don't mind, and then we can kind of see how far we get. Because I'm super interested. I think when I first got a hold of him, somebody lent me Illuminatus, and then they quickly lent me Prometheus Rising. And then somebody told me, I think it was online, I can't remember, that quantum psychology was like Prometheus Rising, the sequel. So I think that was my third. And so that sort of end of his life, the work he was doing at the end sort of became my favorite. And I kind of went back. And then like maybe Logic Academy seemed like such a precursor to like all the online things that are happening now. You want to touch a little bit on the Maybe Logic Academy and sort of where he was at when he designed that?
For sure, yeah, and I totally agree. The format of the Maybe Logic Academy, it was an asynchronous remote learning website, basically, and especially since COVID, every university in America and probably the world has instituted that nearly same exact framework. You can now take college classes more than ever, even now still in a remote learning asynchronous online environment. So, and we're talking the 21 years ago, nearly, the Maybe Logic Academy launched, I believe it was July 23rd, 2004. And it was founded by Robert Anton Wilson and Lance Bauscher, who is now a therapist, I believe. But Lance was the believe he was the director, co-executive producer of the great documentary, Maybe Logic, The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson, which was released on, which premiered on July 23rd, 2003 in Santa Cruz, which I'm happy to say I was able to be at that premiere, which was amazing. And then I interviewed Bob for the first and only time, really, the next day on July 24th, 2003, with the help of David J. Brown, who I met the night of the premiere. And I was like, I already a great fan of Brown's work, from ever since reading Brainchild, and then also that book, Mavericks of the Mind, which he interviews Wilson and a bunch of other luminaries from the 1960s counterculture. And David J. Brown was awesome, and he linked up the interview. I interviewed Bob, and that really put me at another level after meeting Bob, and then digesting the interview. My commitment to really, I think that he might have this effect on a number of people. It's really interesting. It's like you want to read, you want to study everything that he wrote for some reason, and so that's exactly what I did. And then when the Maybe Logic Academy came around, I learned about it, I think around August or September 2004. So I kind of missed the first inaugural class, was the Illuminatus class. And so in that, I think it was a 12-week class, maybe a little longer, it might have been 12 weeks. Wilson broke down, the 10 books of Illuminatus, like each book was a week, and then added a little extra. And it just really brought a whole new dimension to Wilson's work. And that opportunity really to basically study with, it was like hanging out in a studio, really, like the days of old, like artists, and still today, painters or whatnot, will hang out in the artist's studio and do, and learn as they are creating work. And so it was great. Or it's like hanging out in the auto mechanic garage, and Bob's Poppin' the Hood Illuminatus trilogy is like an awesome old Mustang, and he pops the hood and he's like, hey, check this part out, check that part out, meaning it was a great experience. And so I hopped on. I think my first class at Maybe Logic was the quantum psychology class, because as many of the viewers here probably know or familiar with Maybe Logic, Bob basically took almost every one of his books and turned it into a quote unquote class. But the format was, there were, modules for every week, which is what schools use now, modules in their asynchronous learning. And then there was a forum, which also exists even in now, work situations, they have their own little social network stuff, So, and that wasn't because Bob and Lance invented that. They were just early on the wave, Maybe Logic lasted roughly, it was Bob passed away in January 2007, when Maybe Logic was in its, nearly its third year. And Lance and the crew kept it going for a number of years after. But that time of those 2.5 years, the people that were able to take those classes, as you were there. It was like, there was so much learning in there. It was like it felt like graduate school, because other teachers or writers or whatever, facilitators, if you will, there was so many. Rushkoff, Doug Rushkoff came in, Eric Davis, Phil Farber taught a number of classes, Arturo Ali taught a number of classes, Starhawk taught a class, that's just off the top of my head. Peter Carroll, as I mentioned before, Lon Milo Duquette. The list goes on and on. So it was great. It was a fabulous experience. And when Bob died in 2007, I was still engaged with the Maybe Logic Academy because there was still so many cool classes. But for me, something kind of changed. It was like, I at that time of my life, I viewed things kind of like martial arts and like militant. And I was like, my sensei's dead. Now it's my time to go out, and I got to bring the sword. And so really what that meant was I need to test his ideas against I just needed to do more knowledge, read more books, and experience the world with this reality tunnel, if you will, that reading Wilson provided. Like, do his ideas hold weight? Are they useful to contemplate? Does his work really have value for, others beyond, the people that just like the way that he wrote, So that became sort of like the mission, really, from 2007 until I published this book.
Do you feel like you've been working on it since then? Like, do you have like a start date, or did it kind of just morph into something that you then took and ran with it? Or did you like sit down and be like, okay, I'm gonna write this book? Do you remember that start date?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both, to be honest, Zach, because it was like, I think really since I was young, I had a desire to write. I was 15. I was telling my friends, like, I'm gonna be a writer, man. Hardly even knew what that entailed, and I don't know why. I just chose that, and so I was always writing and digesting Wilson's thoughts, but it was very organic, really, because the book, when it was decided, I was like, all right, I'm going to do this book. I'm going to write a book about Bob. I mean, that was always in the background, but the biography itself became clear in 2015. Yeah, because I was working on, just a book about his ideas. And then I was like, I need a biographical spine for Wilson. And one thing that always kind of intrigued me, fascinated me, and like I was like, how the fuck, was how much Wilson talked about how much he moved around, especially in Cosmic Trigger and then other books. And now I was always like intrigued, like, how does this guy pump out so much copy, moving around with a wife and 4 kids, a dog, maybe other pets, and he's got polio and he doesn't drive, and they're moving like, not like from one town to the next, like they're cross country moving. They're moving to Mexico. They're moving all over the place. How did he even carry his typewriters? There was no cell phones then to write some things. Like, you had to carry the old heavy things in a little suitcase, right? How did he carry all his files? How did he keep that all organized, like, while he was moving like this? And then, as you see in Cosmic Trigger, like, the amount of activity that Bob was doing in the mid 70s, from creating classes and teaching them, first and foremost, writing books, working on multiple books at the same time, pumping out articles for many different underground newspapers at the time. Also, like, leading the Free Timothy Leary campaign, pretty much, right? And then having a correspondence with like a ton of amazingly smart and like interesting individuals, while also having a wife and 4 kids, and then dealing with his own decisions of descending into poverty, but working to really get himself out of poverty in his 40s by nothing but his bootstraps, and the help of, obviously, welfare and Section 8, but still, Bob did it through writing books. He didn't, that's magic, meaning he was able to elevate out of poverty through that, So yeah, I was always fascinated, really, but organically, the biography idea emerged, and that was like, I ran with it, because I was like, there's not a biography yet of Wilson. And it made things easier too, in terms of presenting his thoughts, because one description I could provide for Wilson, it's like James Joyce, is that he writes in an exploratory way and not just straight, A to B explanation. I mean, that's the whole point of his philosophy, is that the sort of ecosystems, things don't always go A to B, but he's still a good enough writer to keep the thread of interest going, knowing that we're all trained to get from A to B as quick as possible, subject, predicate, no passive voice, all active voice. And Bob wrote a lot in the passive voice sometimes too, which is pretty interesting. So seeking to update what he's writing, it's like I made sure to put everything, grammatically speaking, in the active voice in this book. Especially now, because readers it's just like more than ever, it's just like facts, images. And Wilson was part of that too, though. He's part of a school of that American school, if you will, of facts, images, from Hemingway to Ezra Pound. Get to the point, but he's such an amazing, interesting paradox, right? Get to the point, but stroll around a while in this exploratory way that I'm writing, meaning he writes kind of cyclically, sort of in cycles, sort of to piece every thread out, like it was very labyrinthian, to like small thin fibers of like, it's not just one long chord. It's like, oh snap, because some writers are just big chords and you could just put their ideas in boxes and just go through them very sequentially. The biography was my attempt to help me get there, to write this book about Bob's ideas. And I think it helped a lot because it really contextualized things well, because like all of us, Wilson's ideas changed over time. And I wanted to also chart that in the biography. What was he thinking when, because he's a bit like a shapeshifter in some ways, because when he's in New York, hanging, in the late 50s, early 60s, he's just a jazz head beatnik, then he goes to the School of Living and he becomes like an individualist anarchist, and he's going hard. And these are things that are always in him. He's always developing, but I think that was what was great about Bob, was he was always developing and always like transforming, and then seeking to transform his ideas into the newest form of communication technologies, and and his last class that he taught at Maybe Logic was for a book that he never finished, called The Tale of the Tribe, and the class was called The Tale of the Tribe. And the only thing he really produced about that book was like a prologue that was put in the back of the 2005 book Email to the Universe, I believe, and just the prologue alone sold a number of books. I thought it was going to be Bob's like magnum opus, really, in terms of nonfiction work. And so it's kind of fitting, though, that he died and the book's called Tale of the Tribe, because it's sort of up to the tribe to write the tale now, So, man, just a fountain of inspiration. And when I focused on the biography, that really, really, really helped, because it was like, I don't necessarily have to deal with his ideas. Now I could contextualize him further, and I've always been fascinated with biographies of artists, So I remember high school, like learning about William Blake's biography or Lord Byron's biography. And I was like, yeah, these guys are hardcore, So and I think people, again, as I said, like people deserve to learn the story of how this guy lived his life. I think there's a lot of lessons in it,
Definitely a lot of lessons. Well, and really, honestly, like being a huge fan of his work, I didn't get until I read your book just how much he struggled. Like, it gave me mild anxiety, dude. I was just like, holy moly, this guy just like struggled, but never faltered, had like 100% commitment to his ideas. And yeah, as a father, I'm just like, man, I don't understand. And then the psychedelic use, like that probably put a little more buzz on the already tense situation, but he just was like so cool about using it, you know what I mean? Making something out of it all. And even to the end, I didn't know that, like, the whole thing about the back taxes at that final, like, it seemed like he was good, you'd finally been like, and then the whole back tax thing, you're just like, it's just like one more way that he was getting tested,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had an idea that Bob, faced some struggles, as we all did reading his book, Cosmic Trigger. It's like, okay, he left a really high paying job at Playboy magazine and went into poverty. Like, on a romantic quest, romantic in the classic term, to like live the life as an artist, you know, a full-time freelance writer at a time when one could maybe feed one's family as a full-time freelance writer, but it was a struggle to get published as opposed to today. Like, you know, it's much easier to publish your stuff, right? More gatekeepers back then. And that's why Illuminatus was so big, you know, when it got the deal, and then when it was finally released, because, you know, there was just less options for people to look at stuff, and books were, you know, and especially that book. I mean, what a great read, you know. But as far as the struggles, I mean, yeah, you know, Jim Morrison once said, you know, or sang, some were born to sweet delight and some were born to endless night. And he got that from William Blake. And Wilson was just that sort of like at that genetic vector, at that vector in time and place. I mean, he grew up poor in Brooklyn. Most of his family were, you know, from Irish immigrants from Ireland, and, you know, his grandparents, I should say, you know, 3 of them came from Ireland and 1 came from Trieste. Or if you read another one of his articles, 2 of them came from Ireland and 2 of them came from Trieste. But all of them, you know, came as poor immigrants to New York City and had that whole experience. And then his father and mother, John Joseph and Elizabeth, you know, they grew up in Brooklyn, and also were very, you know, I think his grandfather was a cop, he wrote, and then his grandfather's name was Alexander, and then his father might have been a fireman. So, I mean, or also worked at the docks of Red Hook. He did at one point do that. So in other words, Bob and he grew up poor in South Brooklyn, like really, and from an environment like that, the most that people could get from that is to maybe get a job at the telephone company, you know, or you become an engineer and maybe get a job designing intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? Like you really made it then, if you will, you know. And so Bob was just not programmed. He was just born a writer. So, you know, like and that's the first thing he told his parents is like, I want to be a writer. And they're like, no, you're poor. We're poor, Bob. Like, it doesn't happen for us, you know, like you're just going to starve, you know. And that's true. You know what I mean? Like, and Bob, you know, Aleister Crowley, I've been saying this, he chose the magic name Perdabu, right? Whatever that is, right. Which means, you know, endure till the end or persevere to the end. But Bob was that. Bob lived that, you know. And not only was it just persevere and hold on with white knuckles, you know, he learned how to like relax on the roller coaster of life and just put his hands up and just, you know, just cheer and scream with all the crazy tilt-a-whirls and loop-de-loops. And he was able to, as an artist, bring people along with him a little bit. And as an artist, which I think holds a lot of value for today, excuse me. Thanks. And this is one of the hard things. He was, you know, born and raised during the Great Depression. So there's this sort of thing like, you know, people say, oh, the greatest generation, you know, Great Depression, World War II generation, if you will, like that stoicism that people held. And I mean, that's a double-edged sword. You know, I think we could all benefit from a little more stoicism today. You know, we're all talking about our feelings and trauma all the time. And I mean, that exists. You know, sometimes you just gotta get out there and just, you know, build something physically, you know, and just put your thoughts aside. You could talk all day about your trauma, you know, but, you know, that generation also, they bottle up things and they don't know how to express certain things. And for how great Bob was at expressing himself, that's one thing I learned in the writing of this biography was, I mean, of course he had his own blocks, you know, and they were like blocks that come from being of that generation, you know. So he was not there was no way at all that he had his private stuff and then his public stuff, but his public face pretty much was his private face, and that he's laid back and fun, but he wanted to spare the people around him from his own pain. And that's, again, a double-edged sword. There are many people who want to live like that, older people, and sadly, they're not as good at that as they think they are. They let everyone know how miserable they are anyway, you know? And and so, but Bob really, you know, as Hunter S. Thompson says, you know, buy the ticket, take the ride. He was like a responsible rock star, man. You know, he's doing all that acid, he's smoking all that weed, but he's seeking to really make sense of this stuff as a scientist, you know. And he went to Brooklyn Tech, very prestigious high school, and he learned, you know, to be trained to be an engineer. That was his cover story that he provided to his parents early on. One, to escape Catholic school, because they're very abusive back then in his neighborhood. Physically, I don't know about any other stuff. But then also as a cover to say, well, I'm going to be an engineer, you know. But his mind already worked like that. As he said, he had a very analytical sort of mind. Like Bob really could have been a very successful engineer, you know, if he kept pursuing that. But the great thing is he brought that engineering mindset to his writing, which makes him, I think, stand out. Like he's also part of that lineage of these popular fiction writers that digest heavy scientific theories and ideas for their readers. You know, Colin Wilson, similar. You know, even in the lineage of H.G. Wells, if you will. But Bob did it in such a way that, like, he just speaks to people, man, like a certain segment of people, like, you know, like for people, again, who are like big fans of George Carlin, like Lenny Bruce, the great stand-ups. He's an extremely funny writer. Bob will speak to you and teach you about quantum entanglement, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the sense of humor, you know, has a lot to do with his ability to endure. And, you know, he always kind of stayed funny. He always stayed a little weird, you know, and which was awesome. And I think that helps. I mean, that's one of the things I've taken to my life that helps, is that, you know what I mean? Always sort of trying to see the funny angle and, you know, the little dark humor. I think that's built into struggling from the get-go, you know.
100%. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, totally. His the ability to find the laugh at the bottom of the barrel. You know, what do you find? It's just the loud, resounding laugh of the universe. You know, is it laughing at you or laughing with you? This we don't know. But I totally agree, and I think that laughter too, like, it triggers relaxation. And I think this is a major part of Bob's work that often goes unrecognized, because he's known, you know, first tier, known as being the conspiracy theory guy, which is generally the complete opposite end of the spectrum of relaxation. But that's what makes him so valuable, is because he's teaching lessons about, you know, utilize, you know, as the subtitle of Timothy Leary's Info Psychology was, like, you know, the operating manual for your brain, right, or your nervous system. You know, Bob's not just like a goofy clown, you know, saying, oh, just have a laugh, you know, but he's breaking down the science and the real function and the magic, you know, because of laughter. Because that reminds me, I think I put it in the book. He wrote this in like the 70s, a little article about basically like laughter magic. Like if someone is like psychically terrorizing you in some way, shape, or form, which, you know, I don't know how, you know, yeah, someone's terrorizing you, right? You get a picture of them, you put it in the center of a circle, you have yourself or maybe some other people, and you just look at that picture and you just laugh. Just laugh, laugh, laugh. You could be laughing at them. It usually is rooted in that, you know. But there's the magic part, right? Which was, it really spoke to, I think, people in the 70s and to later, you know. But then, you know, and he does this in the 90s, he breaks down the neurological like part, which I think that's what is so valuable today. Magic is awesome, you know, but like, you know, as reflected in the recent book, the Eighth Circuit Ascension, you know, like by Douglas Wingate and Dr.
Rachel Turetsky.
Yes, Rachel Turetsky. Yeah. Like those two, what they've done is pretty amazing, because they're updating the map. and that's what Bob always put the focus on. The map is not the territory. We have to constantly update the map. And he believed that about the Eighth Circuit model of intelligence. I mean, it's called the Eighth Circuit model of intelligence. And sadly, there are people who still think him and Leary were talking about circuits of the brain. And they're like, oh, well, their neuroscience was totally wrong. And it's like, okay, but you're kind of wrong, but I'll be polite here, man. Like, because he went beyond that. He went to 8 systems, and so when he's writing about quantum psychology, that book that he put out in the early 90s, he updates the Eighth Circuit model of intelligence by invoking the whole metaphor of systems and feedback loops, which really is what Wilson was always about anyway. I mean, in 1965, he was on WBI radio in New York, talking about cybernetics and anarchism. And, cybernetics is all about feedback loops, so, and then even the knowledge of ecosystems, that goes all the way back to Wilson's love of the book Science and Sanity, by Alfred Korzybski, which created the school of general semantics. And that is about ecosystems, for the most part. The term ecosystem wasn't used until later on, and then even the work of Buckminster Fuller. So Korzybski and Buckminster Fuller are both invoking, they're basically functioning from an ecological ecosystem, framework. And Bob picked that up immediately. I mean, Bob read Science and Sanity when he was 16 years old, so in 1948, he read that book. So this has always been the substrate. I think that book is kind of like if you want to learn about the foundation of Wilson's thought, learn general semantics,
Yeah, I only know general semantics I have not tried to get into Korzybski's writing himself. I kind of got to him through Bob. But it's always a thing that I like have in my mind, like I need to tackle that,
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, that was, again, the value of Wilson, right? Was that he was like the digester, right? And that's the role of what public intellectual is supposed to do. An intellectual is supposed to do. They're the ones that are able to digest all this jargonized material, from all different fields. So Wilson could easily, read not just the narratives, definitions of particle physics. He was also, looking at the equations. He was able to understand calculus. I mean, Korzybski, basically his book was about trying to make language like calculus, so first you need like a foundation in calculus, right? And then Bob also in 1948, if we believe what he wrote, which probably should, right, was reading Claude Shannon, and his big book that basically birthed information theory, and that was full of equations and whatnot. So in high school, Bob thought about us going on to college to study math. He was very interested in the work of Hamilton, imaginary numbers, right? And then I don't remember his first name, but that he was an Irish physicist that came up with this wild math, and gets credited for creating imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers are these things that don't exist; they're imaginary, but yet somehow they work in an equation that can create something that exists. So that was like one of his early lessons in like, yo, this doesn't make sense. This is kind of like magic. Math is the hardest science of all. Not hard to learn. It is hard to learn, but hard and like it results in the most material that can be made from it. You can, you could create technology from math. It's hard to do that with a soft science, if you will, like psychology. We're not going to be creating an equation from that. So, and it's also the easiest to test, right? That's why. So, but within this extra hard science is like a mystery that Bob finds, and he goes right there. Bob goes right to the paradoxical mysteries of everything, right? Because it seems as if I mean, his point is that, just like Korzybski's point, is that these words that we use to describe all these things, they're not it. You know, they're small little, like, you know, thin little veils to give slight impressions to other people, you know. And like Bob goes there, you read Bob and you're like, who are other people? Like, we're all just one communicating organism trying to figure out feedback. And like, so in his work already is the you know, the foundation for a really, like, if you will, a new way of thinking. But the new way is just the old way, and it's the ability to utilize your perceptual apparatus in all, like, turn to the max, you know. Not because we do this all the time, and he writes about this in Prometheus Rising, that we're born able to receive all the stimuli. This is why I think, or many have said, children it's easier to learn a new language, second language, between the ages of 0 and 6. You know, your brain is so plastic, you know, but then through life's traumas and we do it to ourselves and other people, we're constantly smacking each other down until we just get to this really narrow framework and we live from there. And this was Bob's whole point, in my opinion. Leary's too. Leary's circumplex, you know, the 64 areas of basically human experience, you know, that we could and should experience throughout the course of the day. But where do you properly experience your anger and your rage and your hate? Because we have all of that. Well, Wilson and Leary too, they provide answer to that. Like, art, man. You got to use you have to experience these things, because if you keep shutting yourself down, you become less and less and less of like a living organism. And their whole thing is about opening, you know, to the potential that you already have. We already have it, you know. And so that's what I love, especially about quantum psychology, is that digesting, you know, little thought experiments that Wilson kind of suggests, like this term, we are an organism as a whole interacting with an environment, and then as a whole. I don't know if I added that. So Wilson gets that from Korzybski. That's in Science and Sanity. And personally, in my own path with, you know, learning about Bob and stuff like that, I became extremely fascinated with that book after discovering it. But then early on in my life, like I dropped out of college and I went to Hawaii, and I ended up going to like a healing school, basically like Hawaii Healing Arts College. And it's basically it's a body therapy school, right? And the teacher there was this awesome guy, Tate Rolfe, right? Like, shout out to Tate Rolfe, man. Like, cause like our textbook, I still have it. You know, it's like Mosby's, right here. Yeah, Mosby's movement therapy. So point being, you know, this book gets into the you know, at least 12 systems of the body, right? That, like, so it really brought about, that education brought about a deeper understanding of how, you know, my body functions, right? How everybody's body functions. And I was always into hip hop as a kid, so I love this term, knowledge of self. You know, like, what is knowledge of self? Who are you? You know? And so for me, Bob, with all this other awesome stuff, that's where it went. It's like, okay, who are you? Study the systems of your body, you know, provide yourself an education. And this is how I got an education, really, in like biology. You could probably get this, like, but I wasn't into science in high school. Like, reading Wilson brought me back to wanting to learn as much science as I possibly could, because we need science. And so learning about the systems of the body, like, you know, you got your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, your endocrine system, and all these systems that function without our conscious awareness. They're moving along. And that's fascinating to me. And, you know, I was reading quantum psychology over and over and over again, because I was contrasting what Wilson was saying about the eight system model of intelligence in that book. Because in quantum psychology, as you know, Zach, he's going deeper in providing these feedback loops that that happens. So on circuit 1, which was called the oral biosurvival circuit, so now he goes a little deeper. There's a connection between, I don't have it off the top of my head, but maybe between your hypothalamus and your immune system, right? And so just going a little bit deeper, I mean, that blew my mind, and I wanted to find out more, and I wanted to see, was Wilson right? Was Wilson correct? Where does he get these ideas from about these feedback loops? And I mean, that was a fascinating thing, and from that book alone, Quantum Psychology, I mean, Wilson talks about one book in particular, which I think is pretty amazing. It's a book by Ernest Rossi called The Psychobiology of Mind-Body Healing, which it's a book about hypnosis, but it goes deeper because Rossi, he basically updates the jargon, if you will, of hypnosis by utilizing metaphors from information theory. Yeah. And so, and then the way Wilson wrote about it and described it in Quantum Psychology was so amazing, because Rossi talks about these things, state-specific information systems, right? And these are just like states that we enter, like throughout the course of a 24-hour period. We have rhythms, and these different rhythms produce actually different states of consciousness. And in these different states of consciousness, we view ourselves and the world differently. Like, and as Grant Morrison used to say, like, we're already multiple personalities, and we're not aware of it. And Bob just laying that out like that, and then constantly synthesizing. So he's synthesizing then this current neuroscience hypnotism book with then the ideas of Gurdjieff, and he's always doing that when it comes to the talk of hypnotism. He invokes Gurdjieff, as does, well, maybe Colin Wilson, but Bob does it in such a fun way, doesn't he? And so by invoking Gurdjieff, just that's the whole notion of George Gurdjieff, the Greek mystic, who spoke a lot about sleepwalking, and this, and I guess he was a big part of the zeitgeist, if you will, of the 60s and 70s, and the idea of sleepwalking and robots. And Wilson, of course, ran with that metaphor, and essentially, when we're behaving like a robot, we're moving in a trance, we're kind of hypnotized. And so the whole point of hypnotism is to actually break the trance, and I think Wilson's work is constantly breaking trances, in the way that he could describe certain things. And he does it with humor, and he's able to take all these heavily jargonized books and ideas, like from Science Insanity, which Korzybski is writing in a, not the easiest, smoothest way, to Buckminster Fuller's own way of writing, a lot of hyphens in both. And then, to scientific theories, like from the ideas of quantum entanglement down to information theory. Bob is just able to just streamline it in a way that I think is still useful. People have not caught up yet to the book Quantum Psychology, or I should say, insights from that book have not been fully integrated into everyday behavior. And it's most reflected, say, in where social media went, where it went the complete opposite direction of what Maybe Logic Academy was about, which was about opening and being aware of nuance and communication. And that, you can talk to people who hold drastically different viewpoints from you on some very hot, heated topics. And, you could be civil. And because the whole point is we're all on this spaceship planet Earth together, and we're facing a crisis. You never wrote much about climate change, but climate change is real, and it's happening, And so for us to really make sense of all these disasters, we have to be able to communicate and not just be like, you suck. you think this, I'm going to kill you. Where social media just basically has promoted that, sadly.
Yeah. Right. No, absolutely. Well, and like I think he mentions, I can't remember what book, but the idea that it's good to know the difference between different types of arguments, a scientific argument, a legal argument, proofs, the different proofs, and to be able to unpack all that and to go through your own beliefs with that same sort of precision, that scalpel where like, am I believing this because it feels good? And I get a smile from Buddy over there because they believe it too. Or if I'm believing this because I've actually gone through the work, dissected it, tested it, and then came to some sort of momentary conclusion that could, be changed later. I think that's definitely lacking these days for sure.
For sure, yeah. I mean, and that's difficult to implement. I mean, I mean, that's what education is really ideally about, right? Like, I mean, that's what you have to learn. I mean, I've forgotten now, but the quadratic equation, like, or these, but just keeping in mind these things, because it's very easy. And sadly, maybe the distractions of communication technology can draw our attention away from our center, which is basically, another great aspect of Wilson's work is, well, how do you get back to center, when you're surrounded by all these distractions? And, I mean, the conversation of Wilson and hypnosis is super interesting because, I mean, it's even in Illuminatus, the ideas of basically like how he, hypnosis ties into the idea of perception. And in that regard, magicians are somewhat able to hypnotize people, right? I mean, they literally hypnotize people, right? And I think this is one reason Bob liked about the Korzybski book too, because in Science and Sanity, Korzybski gives an example about how about perception and how people are fooled by magicians, not just because magicians are so good, but people want to be fooled by magicians. And every con man and con woman knows that deep in their bones, like they know when someone wants to be fooled, I wouldn't just say con man, advertisers, also know this, right? And politicians know this. The guy about to be president definitely knows this, and so that knowledge of perception, that we fill in the gaps, right? And that we're, and also at this point in evolution, we're a pattern recognition sort of creature. We are constantly trying to, put things into these little boxes. Maybe it's based in the notion of survival from way back when, right? Like, is that a tiger about to bite my head off, or like, a bush, right? And so Wilson, again, he's just able to like pop the hood in all this stuff. And the eight system model of intelligence, if you will, I think is a very useful metaphor still for, he points the finger, he directs everyone, maybe to readers, to a functional place, which is like, you want knowledge of self. Well, here we are, we're speaking about Bob in the 90s, studying neuroscience. The 90s was called the decade of the brain. That was, that was like the scientifically sexy subject, like quantum physics was, in the 70s or 80s. And I mean, yeah, man, kind of, I think I might have lost my train of thought there a little bit.
No, that's all. I mean, I love the whole thing about hypnosis, and he almost went from like, he talked a lot about like kind of Crowley's magic, which is more like almost like ritual ceremony, had a lot more religious aspects to it. Whereas then in the 90s, when he went more with the hypnosis thing, it's all sort of still there and it's all still as practical. I liked it because it was less religious. Like, I love to learn about Crowley through Wilson because I love the way he talks about him. But Well, I just am like not that into like what Crowley did. Like I don't do a lot of like Crowley's magic because
Yeah.
I'm not very religious. And even though he wasn't super religious, he was still religious. You know what I mean? Like, and so I liked where Bob went, and I think the chaos magic stuff went with it as well, is that you don't have to invoke any deities or talk about angels or anything like that to do like practical magic. And so I like how he brought in hypnosis with that idea.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's two generational zeitgeists, especially in the 70s. I think that, Crowley was like, Mr. Crowley. You had Ozzy Osbourne singing about him, right? Like, or Jimmy Page is living in Crowley's, mansion, and actually maybe it starts with the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club's cover, where
Right.
so Crowley was, being rediscovered, and I guess that he was a fresh sort of, because he was forgotten for many years after he died, died sort of a pauper, if you will, and like all the greats, right? Like, and so Bob's part of that sort of maybe that generational thing, and then people who got into Bob in the 70s, 80s, it's also reflected maybe in the music more, not just like the heavy metal, but where it kind of goes with even that gothy new wave. I feel a lot of Thelema in that,
Yeah.
like, and it's cool. It's cool. Like by the 90s, the music, of the youth is like techno, rave, hip hop, electronica stuff. And, that's where I think Bob and Leary and John C. Lilly, like, and Terrence McKenna was kind of like a 90s guy, but they were Bob, Leary, Lilly were like the older heads getting their, every 20 years, I feel like artists get a reappraisal, a new group of people come around like, yeah, this is dope. And then, but like great artists, like Bob is still developing and still growing, like LP, you know what I mean? Like LP, the hip hop producer and MC, like his music is constantly still changing and still in tune with every year that it comes out. So meaning they're doing their job to keep up with the zeitgeist, but it's because Bob was already invoking, utilizing computer technology to elevate your brain state, which was one core of the 90s rave scene, was this knowledge and neuroscience and utilizing psychedelics and dance and shamanistic viewpoints to elevate your brain, like it wasn't much cocaine and alcohol at raves, back then, like it was ketamine, ecstasy, and acid and weed and meth. Like people that, or they called it glass, right? Those kids,
right? Yeah.
Wild raver kids. But so I think when people discovered Bob in the 90s, maybe as younger people, like say reading Illuminatus was like, wow, that's what these wild old hippies were like. But that generation, 90s into early 2000s, like there was already, Bob was an influence on these electronic musician artists, like Cold Cut, the British duo, like they've already were making noise, from the 80s, with their great remix of the Rakim song, Paid in Full, this fusion of electronic music and hip hop, like, which is, again, that was already in the hip hop thing, and like Detroit rave, but like where things went in like, especially by the late 90s, I think Wilson was he was at another peak in his career because he was in tune with the times, man. He was speaking to the kids and he was raw, like he was truly raw, and what's more raw than like, okay, we could do the ceremonial magic, which he writes in the introduction of a 1987 book called Monsters and Magical Sticks.
Yeah, I have that.
Great book,
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so what Bob writes in that book is, the book's, as I said, is published in 87, but he says, when I think about hypnotism, like I've kind of been doing it for the last 15 years, I called it guided meditation So what does that mean? Well, it kind of means that, Bob is utilizing his imagination to affect, the state of his body, mind, which, so he provides a raw definition of hypnotism. That's not the full definition of it, but essentially, I guess that's kind of what it is. So then in that sense, hypnotism is like magic, because we're, utilizing our will to affect change in our environment. Well, if our organism as a whole is interacting with the environment as a whole, well, then, yeah, you change your state, internal, external. Something about the external state seems to have changed. Of course, it could have always been there, but the power of our attention is what has been shifted. And that's the power in Wilson, the hypnotist and magician, is the emphasis on attention, and Graham Morrison has talked about how important attention is in magic, because if you're really paying attention, you find those gaps, and you could use it both ways. You could find those gaps in other people and you could sell them something, like salesmen using neurolinguistic programming or whatever. We're having a team meeting, guys, NLP, always be closing, right? And then, but the way Bob uses it is like a kung fu master. It's like, well, you can recognize when other people are trying to do the 48 laws of power BS on you, and then you just go, bah, 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 and essentially the core of it is like, just get away from toxic people and you're good.
Yeah, right. Well, and it kind of, I don't know if this is a segue or not, but it sort of reminds me of like his talk at the Disinfo conference, and like Grant Morrison also being there, and that, like you were saying, like almost like the rave thing and getting to the youth, who was it that he followed? I remember watching it. I bought the DVDs way back when. Then you mentioned it in the book. He follows some like crazy Karen Black, or who was it? It was who had the wall of vaginas or something.
Yes,
something
yes,
like
yes, yes. I'm let me cue up the name. Yeah, Kembra Fowler.
Yeah,
Kembra Fowler.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. That was wild, right? Yeah, Kembra Fowler is actually she's from California, but she was a part of, I'd say, like the kind of 1980s Lower East Side, New York, kind of transgressive art movement, which was like, those guys the term was transgressive. So they did a lot of stuff with their bodies, which was like, oh God, but part of it was, I think there was some of that was maybe influenced by this notion of fakirism, so this is where I think where it kind of went, where people like to hang themselves on like meat hooks or whatever. That was sort of a 90s into 2000s thing. And, so I wouldn't totally place her in that. So these are like artists like the filmmaker Nick Zed, the poet Lydia Lunch, this filmmaker Richard Kern. I mean, really kind of like, oh, but it was part of that zeitgeist then, this like the late 80s New York punk rock, where it kind of went. So Kembra Fowler came up in this place called ABC No Rio, which was a Lower East Side sort of punk rock squat venue, which was legendary. And so she had a band called The Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black. Karen Black was this strange, unique actress and whatnot. And and Fowler and her band, it was kind of like this fun surf rock thing. And of course, what they did to really kind of shockingly stand out was they would all be naked. She would be naked. Not the dudes, just the ladies, although I don't know. Did the guys ever get naked? I don't know. It was mostly just her and a bunch of like her friends, her lady friends. And like at this info, I believe she was all painted in like either like blue or red, dark red. And she had like wild black hair and like the tall stilettos. So sort of invoking this kind of Betty Page look, And so that they performed at the end of the night. And yes, so everyone was like lit, the whole crowd, like that was a ram. I was there. I was at the Sympho conference.
Oh, nice.
And so, I can attest, like it was at the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City. And like the morning time, it took a while to get going, but by the time Kembra got on stage and then she took it to the next level. I mean, throughout the whole day and night, like Grant Morrison had already spoke, and he he came on stage with it sounded like Jim Morrison, like screeching into the microphone, spilling his drink on his expensive jacket. Talk about he just took some hash or ecstasy or whatever, and like really like caught the spirit of that conference, which was very much like it was like a concert, like slash awesome heavy intellectual presentation. Kenneth Anger was there earlier, speaking, doing some strange like sale of like hypnotism tapes to stop smoking.
Yeah.
But still, it was Kenneth Anger. It was wild. And Doug Rushkoff spoke at the beginning of the day. And then Joe Coleman.
Yeah, the artist.
Coleman. Yeah. The artist, the painter, very great, interesting, also transgressive sort of painter. He did his thing where he one of his pranks or whatever was he tore open his shirt and he had a baking sheet with it was like Roman candles. It was like a mechanism. They like all came out or something like that, aimed straight at the crowd at Hammerstein Ballroom, right? Like where they must have so much insurance or whatever. And he started lighting up all these Roman candles and they just people are like ducking out of the way, right? Like from like these fiery embers, like just shooting right at their heads. And that was at the end of his talk. And then it was just, I'm surprised the fire alarm or extinguishers didn't go off because it was just a cloud of smoke and he just disappeared. He was gone, right? Wow. Magic. And then at some point, then yes, Kembra came on and they performed a great surf rock, sort of like a punk rock sort of thing. But at the very end, it just went to the next level, and I was young, man. So I was like, wow, like her bandmates, they stacked on top of each other, also naked. I think they were all in red and she was in blue or something like that, painted in blue, but it seemed somewhat uncomfortable, but maybe they're yogic. So it was about 3 or 4 ladies. They sat on top of each other, yonis facing the crowd, legs spread wide, like butt on top of butt. And I was like, whoa. and then Kembra had a huge turkey baster full of like white paint, I guess, or something, and just started flopping it around all over the place. Yeah. And everyone was like, holy shit. Everyone, like, and so she did it. They literally, I mean, one of the points of art is to just cause astonishment that stops you in your tracks. And they didn't do it with blood. They didn't do it with gore. They did it with like the human body in like a really artistically interesting, like awesome way. Like it was total punk rock in the best sense of the word. And then, and then they went off. And the crowd was like, holy shit, going crazy. We were like monkeys, dude. We were like it was almost to the point of throwing chairs. And then Bob just kind of like scuttled on stage. Well, Richard Metzger introduced him and he was like, yo, Metzger was so hyped. And then Bob just kind of scuttled on from the opposite end, like kind of like Columbo, like, oh, I can't follow that, or I don't know how I'm going to follow that. And of course he did. And he did it sitting down in a chair, just really getting open about his current thoughts. And, his wife, Arlen, had passed away, a couple years before, right? And when she died, he was like really affected. I mean, they were like partners. So he was really down in the dumps, having the book, a scene from the book, Chapel Perilous, Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, where Richard Metzger is visiting Bob and they're hanging out at Bob's condominium in Capitola on the balcony overlooking the Monterey Bay. Beautiful. And he notices Bob is smoking cigarettes again. Bob had quit smoking years earlier when Arlen had gotten a heart surgery, a quadruple bypass heart surgery. And he was just so scared by it. He was like, I don't want, to smoke. But when she died, he started smoking again. And then sadly, in some ways, or, like a old cowboy, Metzger was like, Bob, Bob was smoking the Cowboy Killers, the old Marlboro Red Pack, and hacking, just like, Metzger was like, dude, are you okay? Like, maybe. And Bob was like, meh. He says something like, as soon as everyone you love dies, you don't care so much.
Wow.
So, and isn't that interesting? And this is the complexity of Bob, and anyone really who's experiencing life is, as Walt Whitman said, like, I contain multitudes. Do I contradict myself? Of course. If you're really paying attention to yourself throughout the course of the day, you'll contradict yourself every however many minutes,
Yeah, right.
And bringing it back to Gurdjieff and then Bob, which is like, you try to think of, we're in this interview, but like, say before or after what you did 5 minutes ago. And if it's difficult to really invoke that, you're in a trance, because that trance is basically, it's when you're lost in thought, quote unquote. You are somehow projecting this amazing capacity that humans are able to create. We're constantly able to create these, Phil Farber had a nice term for it. Now I don't quite remember. It's like these mimetic entities. I think that's what it is. Santa Claus is a mimetic entity, Jesus, God, Buddha, these could all be mimetic entities, right? We've created these things, as Carlin said, we've created God in our own image and likeness, not God creating man in his own image and likeness, right? And so we project these mimetic entities out onto the real universe, the existential world, right? And then we get into wars and fights over, you don't believe in my imaginary friend? You're a heathen. I'm going to kill you. Or like, I'm going to kill you because my imaginary friend is hurt. So that's,
or even like the Christian Catholic thing where they even have the same imaginary friend. They just differ on how they're going to talk about him. You know what I mean? Like, or how they're going to worship him. But it's the same friend, but they'll kill each other just based on like the slight differences in how they relate to that.
100%. Yeah. I mean, like all the wars that occurred in Europe, the Protestant Catholic wars or whatever throughout Europe, 1700s, right? Some wanted to say it was that going on in the north of Ireland, that Protestants and Catholics couldn't just get along. But if you really look at that situation, the troubles in Northern Ireland, you see it wasn't that, it wasn't just that. But the point being that, Bob is able to just speak to that, I guess, voice of reason inside you, that when you really look at things, it's like, well, and this is the value of science. It's like the theory of falsifiability. Like some statements are made that you can't even test to see if they're true or false or not. And most of those are religious statements, and Bob's emphasis on the importance of us as, back in the day, I don't know if it was in Greece or Rome, like the idea of being like a free individual. It wasn't just you were just born. I mean, we are in some sense, Rousseau, born free, but this notion of in society, like you got to prove your worth in some ways. Like you got to prove, like with great freedom comes great responsibility. Can you take the responsibility of being free? And what is that? What does that entail? And Bob is very existential in that sense. Like he's drawing your attention to the quote unquote existential real world, which is just like meditating. Like if you sit on a mat and meditate, like you are, one school of meditation is just pay attention to all the times that you create these false narratives in your head. I had one time when I was meditating. I mean, it was like an hour-long meditation many years ago, and it was like a meditation retreat. So I was like meditated out. Like they exhaust you at meditation in those things. And I was sitting on the mat, and I swear to God, like I had this. I thought that the alarm went off, and that I got up and I started stretching, and then I came to, and I was still on the mat meditating. So if the brain is just producing these things beyond our conscious thought, which is what Wilson and others say, we're constantly creating these mimetic entities. It's beyond our control almost. Well, the only thing that we might have control of is just our awareness of when we're doing this. And I think that's a core of Wilson's work, you know?
Yeah. I'd love to know like a little bit about his European success and his time in Ireland. It seemed like something about Europe caught him. Like, did he have like, he seemed like he got a little resurgence going on when he was in Europe.
Yeah, for sure he did, didn't he? I think the part of his success in Europe was Ken Campbell's stage production of Illuminatus trilogy. And I forgot to mention this before, just to touch back on the awareness of hypnotism in Illuminatus trilogy. In Illuminatus trilogy is represented in the use of the Fnords. You know, so in that book, you know, newspapers have the word Fnord between every other sentence or whatever. And this actually is to cause anxiety within people, and then to make them either want to consume more or feel on edge and hyper vigilant to some enemy outside or inside that wants to get them. Right. And so you're one step towards liberation when you quote unquote see the Fnords, you know. So when Joe Malik or George Dorn finally saw the Fnords in that book, you know, you gain one level of liberation. And I mean, that was a simple metaphor about consumption and capitalism in my viewpoint. You know, can you see when they're trying to grab your attention? And this is the whole point of Wilson. Can you, you know, he kind of brings you to this thing of awareness of your center, and then are people or other things, even yourself, trying to pull you off center. And this happens all the time. But Wilson in Ireland, he moved to Ireland with Arlen in June 1982. From letters that I read, there was a number of letters that Bob wrote to people from Ireland, like that I was able to access, you know, to Greg Hill, the co-founder of Discordianism and a old friend of Wilson's. I have some letters of Wilson to Greg Hill, but I was able to get a huge cachet of letters exchanged between Bob and Kurt Smith, who was an old friend and old friend of his. And I got that through Michael Johnson, who I believe he got it from Mike Gathers. Right. And it's like this, I wonder if what Hilaritas they should do something with these letters. I think they're great. It's like almost 50 letters of Bob's. And that's the most continuous batch of letters I was able to access. It's almost his whole time in Ireland, you know, so about 6 years worth of letters. And Bob and Arlen moved to Ireland. They just needed a break from everything that was going on in the States. Luna was murdered in October 1976, Bob's only biological daughter. His son, Graham, had a schizophrenic breakdown shortly after. And this was all when Bob was finally achieving some success as a writer. Illuminatus was published in September, October, November 1975. And then for those few years between 76 and 82, they lived in two different places. It just, the pressure became very hard. You know, Graham's illness was very, it was a lot, you know, and it wasn't just that. Kerry Thornley was sending Bob letters, and it seemed like he might hop out of the bushes and just shoot him one day when he was coming out of his apartment. So Bob felt they were very on edge. And then a murder occurred in the apartment house that Bob and Arlen were living in San Francisco, in the Park Merced housing complexes, where Sam Rockwell actually grew up, the great actor. And Park Merced is a very interesting part of San Francisco, huge towers, but this woman was a neighbor a few doors down, was murdered, and they were like, okay, it's time to leave. And they would tell people that they're leaving also because Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, but they end up leaving in June 82. They arrive in Ireland for Bloomsday. And it was also the centennial celebration of, I think, the birth of James Joyce. So I think he was born in 1882, which is also the year that Bob's mom was born, 1882. He writes that initially they were just going to go out for a visit, but it quickly turned into them being like, okay, we're going to move here. I'm not very clear. Maybe they were trying to move, but they, their first year that they were in Ireland, 6 months to a year, Bob actually became very depressed and anxietous. He felt like it was a mistake to move to Ireland and Europe because he believed that he wasn't really getting much work. As he writes to Kurt Smith, he's like, yeah, my depressions, I forget what he says, but it's like, this is caused by lack of money. And then he started questioning his whole path. He's like, is my work really of value? Like, am I really creating something? He's like, I feel like the people who like my work are they're even weirder than me, and it was, I think, Bob had these cycles in his life too of, almost like, I don't want to say it, it was almost like a manic, and then he would get very depressed, and his manic stages. I mean, he produced a ton of work. So when he first gets to Ireland, it's amazing. Bloomsday, 1982, it's like a dream come true. He's a total James Joyce fanatic. It's amazing. They live in Howth, that exact area of Dublin where Joyce lived for a spell, and of course Ulysses is centered. But very quickly after they get situated, Bob's questioning his whole existence almost, and then in 1983, his good buddy Ken Campbell basically comes to the rescue in a yellow submarine, and the Leif Erikson, he sails over from London over to Dublin town, and he scoops Bob up and he takes him on the yellow submarine, and they go back and they go to Old Smoke, and Campbell plugs him in. Ken Campbell, and Ken Campbell, of course, he's pretty much he's a star in London. He's an actor at the time. He's a very interesting theater director, influenced by anarchism. He's like the British stage anarchist guy. He's doing wild stuff, and he's able to find people with talent, just like Bob. So one of the early collaborators, not just the actors, because the first actors in that stage rendition of Illuminatus in England, some of them went on to become very big stars in British film and television, right? But and Ken Campbell himself and his wife. But then he, as a stage production, what's the term? The prop maker, the person who created the stage, basically, was Bill Drummond, who later on goes on to found KLF, which that music group, and they became a huge sensation in the UK and Europe and the world. I mean, they even broke in America. I mean, I still listen to that album, The White Room, the KLF album. It is a classic. And so because of Illuminatus trilogy, the stage production in the UK, Bob becomes more famous in a way out there than he does in America. And although he is it's just his own personality. He's not even aware of any type of fame that he has, you know. Many years later at the Disinfo conference, like I snuck into the green room, right? I was hanging out with all these people. I met Bob. I was like, he signed my book. I still have the book. He signed Illuminatus, you know, like I was hanging with all these fools. And so Morrison tells me that Grant Morrison went up to Bob. And of course, Grant Morrison is big and majorly influenced by Bob, as is Alan Moore, and then Steve Moore, and then this guy Brian Talbot, who was a big comic. Like Wilson, like I don't want to speak too much, but he could be the biggest influence on the quote unquote British invasion, you know, that late 90s comic book scene from these awesome comic writers from the UK and Ireland and the north of Ireland, you know, from Morrison Moore to Garth Ennis, so many, you know. But Morrison went up to Wilson at the Disinfo conference, and he like genuflects on a knee, and he's like, "Oh, you are the guy, you know, you're the man." And he's like, "Man, Bob just looked at me like he didn't even know who the fuck I was, man. Like he was just like, all right, man, that's cool." And and that's not a knock at, you know, Morrison's amazingly awesome work. It's more like Bob had that already, that sort of that framework. He's not even thinking like, did I really have this much of an influence? He's constantly questioning like, is my work, does it really hit? And he doesn't get that until, you know, it happens slowly over the years that he's like, oh, cool, my work is having an impact of, you know, positive value. And so Campbell in '83 scoops Wilson up, plugs him in to the London scene. So Bob gets a deal with a playhouse to write a play, which eventually turns into Wilhelm Reich in Hell, which he then staged at Trinity College, I believe, in Dublin. And then him and Ken Campbell, Bob lands a deal to produce a spec script for a BBC television show, which doesn't seem to go anywhere, but he does get a kill fee. And that's when he learns, like, holy shit, like the money in publishing is peanuts compared to the money in film and TV. This is where he's like, man, I got to get something going with this. And then, but then that visit with Campbell, he starts getting work. It sparks off another like huge engine in Bob, and he goes on another tear. And by 1985, he's written not only The Earth Will Shake, the first in his historical Illuminatus chronicles, right? His historical fiction book. And the plan with that book was he said, he's like, maybe I should just start writing historical fiction novels like Bob Shea. And maybe I could just sell a number of these books and just crank these out and just get some money going. And by that point, he's almost given up on like writing a bestseller, you know, even though The Earth Will Shake is like, that's the most, you know, airport book worthy of his fiction books, you know. You don't have to delve too deep, and it's a simply told story. But by the time his second book in the historical Illuminatus chronicles comes around, Bob's artistic mind, he can't just write in one like form. He's at heart like a modernist. He's informed by the modernist writers and poets. He's an experimentalist with prose, and he can't help it because he may not know it, but he might. Bob's a writer for the internet age. It's in nearly all of his books that he's preparing himself and others for this age that we're now in. Illuminatus trilogy, in some ways, it reads like you could be flipping through channels on a TV, but it also reads like all these open windows on your web browser. And within mid-sentence, you're going to another web browser because, you know, and so he's already kind of presaging all of this stuff within nearly all of his work, in my opinion, you know. And so he's on a tear in '85, and then he produces The New Inquisition, which that's where he gets that notion of people should learn the difference between assertions and arguments and legal assertions, historical. And I mean, The New Inquisition is a really fun read. It's his most polemic sort of work. He's attacking, if you will, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, and the kind of academics, skeptics of the day. That's a great book to read, fun read. But so by 85, 86, man, Bob is now, he's 84, 85, 86. Bob is rolling again. He's very comfortable in Ireland. He's comfortable in Europe. He's writing for a magazine, which I think is called the New Age Journal. And that's so he's going to London frequently to interview like these great writers and thinkers. So that's when he first meets Colin Wilson. And he hangs out with Wilson a couple times, and which was so much fun to really discover that Bob and Colin Wilson hung out and actually got along, because I think a lot of people who read Wilson who read Robert Anton Wilson probably also read Colin Wilson. And you kind of want to, you fantasize sometimes like, oh, all these cool guys, man, they got to be friends, right? And so yeah, they become friendly. Wilson also interviews like Doris Lessing, David Bohm, the physicist. He even interviews the woman who wrote the Mary Poppins story. Rupert Sheldrake. And then this is where you see how Bob, this is pre-internet, of course, like how does Bob collect his own research? Well, it turns out he collects a lot of his research through actually physically meeting these people, so Colin Wilson gave him a stack of his own books. And so one of which was A Criminal History of Mankind. And that book in particular is an influential text in Bob's The New Inquisition. He takes a lot of things, especially what Colin Wilson says about hypnotism and how people would rather retreat into their own delusion of reality than face existential reality, and then when those people start getting into conspiracy theories, that's when things get crazy. And I say those people, we can easily become those people throughout the course of a day, Wilson finds success in Europe, and then in Ireland itself, he's over there in Dublin, and he finds that he has Irish fans, which totally delights him. And these two young fellas, Desmond O'Byrne and Simon Cormody, they're in a band called the Golden Horde, which is like a psychedelic, punk rock band. And they're on the scene, man. They eventually open for U2. Simon and Bono are still good friends. They approach Bob when Bob is doing a lecture at Trinity College. And they're like, oh man, we love your work. Would you ever want to collaborate on something? And he's like, yeah, sure, of course. And then they collaborate eventually on an EP called The Chocolate Biscuit Conspiracy by the Golden Horde and Robert Anton Wilson. He's also on the album cover. And it's so funny because that album charts and peaks that summer at number 23.
Nice.
So Wilson's time in the UK is a fruitful one. And his touring life, he wrote that like he, in a letter, I think to Kurt Smith, that he always wanted to live a cosmopolitan life. And finally out there, he believed he was getting it, because now that he's in Europe, he's able to really, nurture his fan base out there, because Bob never had the backing of like the big publishing house machines behind him. He didn't have the promo and the PR, and he didn't have the reputation of Leary and Burroughs, and he was hardly ever, if ever, mentioned in any mainstream newspapers or whatever. Like maybe one of the only times he was mentioned in such newspaper was when he got arrested in Yellow Springs, Ohio, for taking part in a civil disobedience demonstration to resegregate a segregated barbershop. But besides that, Bob is, although he's at the scene, like we'll see these close-up pictures of the icons of that day, like Leary, if you will. But then if you pull back the camera, you'll see Bob is like right next to him or two heads down. So this is why his story is so important, because he was there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like he was literally there, and he has a lot to share about all that, you know? So, and then he was there in Europe and touring Europe, doing tours in Germany, the UK, Ireland, you know, even Switzerland. And at the same time, he's going to America. And then that's where he links up with the Church of the Subgenius, you know, Reverend Stagg in Austin, Texas. And his fan base just keeps growing, you know, throughout the 80s, both in Europe and America.
That is fascinating. Well, we're kind of getting on to time here. Is there anything else that we haven't touched that you'd like to touch? Or I was also going to ask if what's next for you? Where do you go from here?
Oh wow. Honestly, at this stage, I'm not quite sure. You know, the book is out. I ended up putting the book out myself, self-publishing it, which was a really interesting experience. Learned a lot, especially about editing, which was great. And now I'm, you know, really literally it's about promoting the book. You know, I just want to get this book in as many hands as possible, because I've self-published it. I guess it won't be able to be in some bookstores or whatever, but that's kind of okay, because since COVID, I mean, bookstores have changed. Yeah, so I think I'm just going to keep promoting the book for now. Maybe write a few more things related to this book in particular. Like I have, maybe your viewers can tell me if this is a good idea. I have still a bunch of interviews, kind of just like the raw interviews, that I was thinking of maybe compiling into like a little short book, just to kind of go along with this book, because especially the interview with Saul Paul Sarag, the particle physicist, who was basically like Bob's mentor and teacher in quantum entanglement. I mean, dude, I was asking tons of like quantum physics questions. So if yeah, maybe people might have some value in that. I'm you know, working on getting the engine turning to produce a audible version of Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. And I would like to do a book tour for this book, ideally in the summertime. But yeah, there's a lot of things I would just need to, boxes I need to check first before then. But in the meantime, I mean, I'm constantly putting up material related to the book, but also my own ideas on my website, chapelperilous.us. So for instance, I'll put up, you know, pictures of specific letters that Bob wrote. You know, I have this awesome letter from 1965 that Bob wrote to William Burroughs. That's on my website right now. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm just going to keep writing and keep creating.
Love it. Well, we will definitely link all those links in the show notes. And Gabriel, I can't thank you enough for doing this with me today. It's such an awesome conversation. And thanks for the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, telling everybody about it. And yeah, I really appreciate you. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much, Zach. Thanks for having me on here, man.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to Gabe for taking the time to chat, and to Zach West for guest hosting once again. Thank you, as always, to the Robert Anton Wilson Trust, and thank you to Rasa of Hilaritas Press for editing, production, and all-around awesomeness. Our next episode will feature frequent guest and friend of Bob, Eric Wagner. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas.